Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing Deng Xiaoping and the transformation of China with Harvard's Ezra Vogel. I'm Michael Soni, professor of Chinese history at Harvard, and I will serve as the moderator for this forum. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Ezra Vogel. He is the Henry Ford II Professor of the Social Sciences Emeritus at Harvard, an expert on both Japan and China. He's visited Asia every year since 1958. Over his career, Professor Vogel has authored or co-authored 15 books and many articles for both academic and popular journals. The Japanese edition of his 1979 book, Japan is Number One, Lessons for America, is still the all-time bestseller in Japan of nonfiction by a Western author. In 1987, he began studying the transformation of China, spending 8 months at the invitation of the Guangdong provincial government, exploring the economic and social progress of the province since it took the lead in pioneering economic reform in 1978. The result was his book, One Step Ahead in China, Guangdong Under Reform, which appeared in 1989. Professor Vogel retired from teaching in 2000. I arrived at Harvard in 2007, and I'm truly grateful for the mentoring and the encouragement and the friendship that Ezra has offered a far more junior colleague since his retirement. But of course, befriending junior colleagues has not been his main focus in the years since his retirement. Rather, he's devoted his time to completing his book on Deng Xiaoping and his era. The book was recently awarded the Lionel Gelber Prize for contributions to international understanding. I'm sure it's going to be the first of many awards for this extraordinary book. The masterful and comprehensive study chronicles Deng's rich and intricate career from his birth in 1904 at the end of the Qing dynasty to his death in 1997, only a few months before the return of Hong Kong to the mainland. Deng's life spanned almost a century of dramatic changes in China as it experienced war, revolution, the Maoist era, and finally the economic boom of opening up and reform. And Deng played a major role in his nation's politics and development over that period. How did Deng Xiaoping find a way to turn China into a wealthy and powerful member of the international community? What personal and cultural factors contributed to his success? What obstacles did he face? How did Vogel go about researching and writing this study of Deng's life and legacy? Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Ezra Vogel.
Thank you very much, Mike. It's a great pleasure to be introduced by Mike Soni, who is one of the young stars in China studies around the world, having gotten a PhD at Oxford and coming from Canada originally, and Harvard is very lucky to have him as a professor of Chinese history. When I was retiring from Harvard in 2000, I was trying to think what I could do that would help make Americans better understand what was going on in Asia. And I decided, we need to get a little closer. I decided that, of course, China is the most complicated problem that we face in the future. And that to understand China, one of the most useful ways would be understand the transformation that took place in China that set it off on the path that it's going. Just as if you want to understand the United States, if you understand Madison, Jefferson, Washington, how they formed the country, that would be a very good basis for understanding what was going on in the United States. So current China was very much shaped by Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping came to power in 1978, and he really was the dominant person right up until 1992, for a period of about 14 years. What I thought I would do in the brief time today, I was told to not talk more than 20 minutes, would be to talk about some of the forces that shaped Deng, that made him what he was, and what he did to transform China. Because in 1978, the country he inherited had a per capita income of less than $100 per capita. Now it's estimated somewhere around 6,000, and it's on the path that Deng set it on. There was almost no migration from the countryside to the city, and since he came, perhaps 200 million people have moved from the countryside to towns and cities. When he came to power, the country was still involved in the Cultural Revolution, and people were full of enmity toward each other. And he worked to unite the country to set it on the new path. What are some of the forces that shaped him? One, when he was 15 years old, he was in a county high school in Guang'an County in Sichuan. And at that time, the year 1919, just after the Versailles Treaty, there was an outbreak of student movement in Beijing, where people, it was really the first budding of Chinese nationalism. And Deng at that time was a youth in the high school, but a few high schools who were very progressive joined in the demonstrations. And Deng joined in the demonstrations. Eric Erickson has talked about how certain youth at a certain time, when they have their identity formed with a movement or with an institution, it becomes very basic, central to his whole life. And so his dedication to national purpose really began already at age 15. The second thing I would mention is his experience in France from 1920 to 25. After World War I, a lot of Chinese students wanted to go abroad. They didn't have the opportunities that they have today to study in the United States and Europe and Australia and Canada and get scholarships. What the idea was of some leading Chinese business people was that they would send students abroad who would work part-time, and then they would earn money, and then they would study at universities and come back and bring what they learned to China and help build up a new, strong China. At the time, Deng Xiaoping was 16. He was one of the youngest in the group to pass the exams to go to France. And of all the countries that Chinese students wanted to go to at that time, France was the main one. During World War I, about 500,000 Chinese workers went to the Soviet Union to work, and about 150,000 went to France. So there were a lot of work opportunities in France, and the Chinese thought that that was a great center of civilization. And so a group of youth went to France in 1920, early 1920s. And from that group came the Communist Youth League. What happened was, to get there, first of all, they had to be pretty well educated, and that meant their parents had to have money. So they were not from the worker class or the peasant class. They were from the landlord class and the bourgeois class. But when they got there, what they found was that there were no jobs for them, that the French who survived the war had come back. France was suffering from an inflation and depression, and there weren't any jobs. And the factory jobs that were available went to Frenchmen, and they saw that the capitalists were living in very lavish homes and living in a very luxurious style of life, and yet the workers were very poor. And at best, the Chinese who were over there could get dirty, greasy jobs that ordinary French workers didn't want to get. So when they formed their study groups and tried to think of what's the broader explanation of what's going on, what just happened several years earlier in the Soviet Union in 1917 made a lot of sense. It seemed like that the bourgeois people were exploiting the working class, and that the countries that were already fairly well developed were exploiting, the imperialists were exploiting those from poorer nations. And so that group that had gone to France, that was so disappointed that they could not study in the universities, they were not able to save enough money to get into universities. And so they just continued to work in factories. And they were very disillusioned, both with their own country for not coming up with scholarships when they had been encouraged to go there, and for the French government for not making any effort to support them. And so they formed the Communist Youth League. The leader of this group in France was Zhou Enlai, who was about 6 years older than Deng, and who later became premier and foreign minister, and was the one who greeted Henry Kissinger and Nixon when they went to China in 1971-72. The third experience, I think, that was very critical